students, in the earlier lectures we understood the meanings of growth and development and the scope and subject matter of development economics. In this lecture we shall check the characteristics of developing countries and we will further understand some measures of inequality and human development. The objectives of this lecture are: understand the characteristics of less developed economies, be able to draw a distinction between developing and developed countries based on their characteristic features, evaluate factors which are impediments to the process of economic development, be able to grasp how can we develop our own economy and the society, understand how human development can be measured. Let us look at the characteristics of less developed or developing economies. The first characteristic of developing economies is high population burden. Developing countries are those which are passing through the stage of demographic transition and hence face a phenomenon of population explosion. Population explosion is a phase of development when a country experiences very high birth rates or very insignificantly falling birth rates and declining death rates. As a result, the difference between birth rate and death rate is very high. Population increase is actually the distance between birth rates and death rates. Another characteristic of developing countries is these countries have low levels of national and per capita incomes and inequitable distribution of income. Low levels of national income means that a country has not produced more output. Lower national output means that a country has not productively employed its factors of production or utilized its resources efficiently. On the other hand, low income means the country has lesser amount of money to spend on infrastructure, health, education, utilities and ultimately lower social and economic welfare of the people. Hence, countries with low levels of national income may be called developing countries. However, level of national income is not a sufficient indicator of development. Some countries have relatively high amount of national income, but their population is also very high, which keeps the per capita income lower. On the other hand, some countries have lower levels of national income, but the size of their population may be smaller, which keeps their per capita incomes higher. Some countries have a high level of national income, but are not able to utilize and manage it equitably, leading to high amount of inequality, poverty and deprivation for a large segment of the population. Hence, per capita income is considered a better indicator of development. A higher per capita income means the average income per person is higher and therefore indicates greater production or availability of goods per person. However, per capita income is only a mathematical average and in reality some people might be receiving much higher income than this average, while many others may be receiving much lower income than this average. For instance, if an income of rupees 1 lakh is divided among 1000 persons, each gets an average of rupees 100. But if the same income is divided among 2000 persons, each one gets only rupees 50. Besides, an average income of 100 does not mean each person gets rupees 100. Some may get rupees 500 in actual distribution, while some may get only rupees 10 each. Hence, such unequal distribution indicates failure on part of the system to give equitable employment opportunities to all or to distribute the incomes in a fair manner. Now friends, developing countries are those countries where there is high dependence on agriculture and slower pace of industrialization. This is another characteristic. These countries are highly dependent on agriculture for employment and generation of national income. A significantly large proportion of population is dependent on the primary sector. Growth of the agricultural sector is generally relatively lower than that of the industrial sector, as there are natural restrictions on output, variety of output and price elasticity of domestic demand and exports is lower. Even if price is reduced, demand cannot be raised beyond a certain level. Demand for food and agricultural goods are limited to necessary demand. Demand for commercial crops is relatively higher. This is what we mean by lower elasticity. Agricultural sector can develop better if technology and capital are cheap and easy to access. But in such countries, pace of industrialization and capital formation is lower, and hence agricultural sector faces scarcity of physical and financial capital. Another characteristic here is resource scarcity. Countries which face scarcity of natural resources like land, climate conducive for agriculture, etc., and essential man-made resources like electronic resources, food, tools and so on, as well as scarcity of technological resources, for example, internet facilities in the present times, are not able to provide enough goods or skills to a large proportion of their population, and hence the welfare of their people tends to be lower. Resource scarcity may arise due to natural factors or high population burden. For any country, resources prove to be scarce when the growth of population is too high for the available resources to fulfill the basic needs of all the people. If population growth rate is very high, production of basic goods must keep pace in fulfilling the demands. But production of goods depends upon availability of resources and productivities of the factors of production. In other words, population growth must be in accordance with the country's capacity to produce goods, or the country must enhance her capacity to produce goods to provide for the welfare of her rising population. Otherwise, population becomes a burden upon resources. Still another characteristic is the slow pace of technological advancement. Some countries are not able to cope up with the pace of technological advancement taking place in the world. These are countries which are not able to easily develop their own technologies and have to buy technologies from other countries. In order to buy technologies from other countries, these countries need huge amounts of foreign exchange which they do not have. Prior to the economic reforms of the 90s, the developed world used to sell their obsolete technology to the developing countries, especially we are taking the example of Indian economy, at very high rates. Hence, developing countries used up most of their foreign exchange reserves in buying outdated technology and could not grow faster as technologies were outmoded. Since the 90s, countries of the world have become more open to foreign direct investment, and through FDI, developing countries get more updated technologies from the developed nations. Still another characteristic can be discussed as low productivity of factors. Countries which experience low productivity of factors of production usually struggle to produce enough goods to meet demands. Factor productivity can be evaluated in relation to the rising demands in comparison with the productivity of similar factors in other countries or in relation of capacity utilization. Traditionally, there are 4 factors of production: land, labor, capital and enterprise. Let us now look at another characteristic, which is mismanagement of resources. Some countries are not able to manage the allocation and distribution of available resources and goods among different sectors and segments of population. This is because of a number of reasons like lack of political will, corruption, civil unrest, which leads to disruption in the distribution process, along with wastages, poor logistics, inefficient administration, inefficient governance, frequent occurrence of natural disasters and poor disaster management machinery, which also disrupt the distribution process and lead to wastages and so on. Low rate of capital formation is yet another feature. Low rate of capital formation results in lower development. Capital formation means cumulative increase in a country's stock of tangible assets over a long period of time. A given stock of capital, when used productively, helps to build up more capital. For example, if mining is well developed in a country, the production of steel will be efficient. Steel helps to create infrastructure and machinery, which in turn help to boost production and trade. Production and trade help in generating more incomes. When a nation saves a proportion of the income and invests it productively, new capital is formed. Low levels of savings and capital formation in relation to the population naturally mean lower welfare, and therefore, countries with lower rates of savings and capital formation are called developing countries. Now, let us look at another characteristic, that is, these countries are predominantly agrarian and unorganized structure of employment prevails and the pace of industrialization is slower. Countries that are predominantly agrarian cannot grow faster. Demand for agricultural goods remains to some extent fixed. The demand for food grains remains fixed by the size of the population, and thus demand driven growth is limited in the agricultural sector. Besides, the demand for cash crops can grow only when industrial sector grows and capital formation is high. When industrial sector is smaller, more people are dependent on agricultural sector. When more than required people work on a fixed plot of land, the productivity of the extra persons becomes 0. In other words, there is disguised unemployment, but all the so called employed people share the income generated from the fixed land, and thus the per capita income also reduces. According to Ragnar Nux, the disguised labor should be shifted from agriculture to industry, where their productivity can be raised. But industrial sector can grow gradually with increase in efforts, productivity of factors, technological advancement, capital formation, education, etc. Hence, in developing countries, the shift from agricultural predominance to industrial predominance is slower. Besides, when industrial sector is relatively smaller, greater proportion of urban employment takes place in the unorganized sector. Employment in the agricultural sector is generally unorganized. In the unorganized sector, wage structure is exploitative, job security does not exist, and labor welfare is lesser. Such structures result in high rates of unemployment and high amount of underemployment. Next characteristic feature is stated as excessive rural urban migration. Developing countries are also characterized by a large extent of rural to urban migration of people. People migrate for jobs, comfortable life, for education, for exposure and experience of a professional world, for entertainment and so on. Developing countries have lopsided development of economic and social infrastructures, and rural areas have highly inadequate facilities and opportunities. Imbalanced regional development is yet another characteristic feature. These economies do not have enough resources to develop all the regions and sectors simultaneously. Hence, some sectors and regions are more developed than the others owing to biased investment patterns. For example, when a less developed nation attempts to industrialize, majority of her resources are spent in creating roads, ports, bridges, power generation stations, and most financial resources are directed to various businesses. As a result, the nation does not have enough resources to spend on agricultural sector, sometimes even on the socio-economic infrastructures like health and education. Likewise, some states or cities may be more developed than the others. One more feature is the existence of dual economic setup. When the less developed nations make aggressive efforts towards development, some sections within one sector may become highly advanced, while others within the same section suffer from backwardness. For example, in India, until recent times, we find that while banking sector in urban areas is highly modern, there are people even in urban areas as well as in rural areas who do not have a single bank account, and there are villages which do not have a bank branch at all. On our roads, we find highly advanced automobiles and bullock carts plying together. These are countries which have typical structure of foreign trade. Hence, the structure of foreign trade becomes another characteristic feature of developing countries. Developing countries have to import more goods while their capacity to export is relatively lower. In the initial years of development, these countries import more goods essential for survival of their population like food. As they start industrializing, they import more industrial goods and capital goods, also called developmental imports, like imports of machinery, raw materials, energy, technology, etc. After the process of industrialization takes off, the maintenance imports tend to increase. Maintenance imports are essential for maintaining the growth and pace of industrialization, and these constitute advanced or green technology imports, spare part imports, and so on. In the initial years of development, these countries are able to export only primary goods as they are not industrially well developed. The price elasticity and exchange rate elasticity of these goods, that is, the agricultural goods, tends to be low, and thus these countries cannot easily increase exports of such goods. Besides, owing to high population and lower productivities of factors of production, these countries have lesser exportable surplus. As these countries start industrializing, the industrial and service sector exports tend to increase, but it takes time to compete with the quality of industrial goods in the international market. Hence, these countries usually have negative balance of trade. They have to borrow more on the capital account of their balance of payments, and hence the debt burdens are also very high. One feature which we state towards the end, but is extremely important, is high magnitude of poverty, higher inequality of income distribution, low levels of literacy, superstitions and unscientific way of living. Owing to lesser resources, low productivity of factors, high growth rate of population, etc., these countries have a high propensity to consume for several needs and have lower savings to create more capital, to increase literacy or to improve conditions of living. Now, owing to all the features above, we find another typical characteristic, which is existence of vicious circle of low incomes, low productivity and unemployment. Developing countries experience a vicious circle of lower development. These countries have a high growth of population. High growth of population leads to lower employment. Owing to lower employment, there is higher dependence on agriculture. In the agricultural sector, incomes are lower. Hence, there is an high incidence of poverty. High poverty leads to further lowering of incomes. Lower incomes lead to illiteracy, malnutrition, and illiteracy and malnutrition lead to lower productivity. Because of lower productivity, employability becomes low. Because of lower employment and lower incomes, corruption sets into the system. Corruption leads to furthering of poverty. Poverty leads to superstitions, lack of awareness and nurtures further growth of population. Lower incomes for the government, lesser utilities and ultimately lower human development. This way, one negative characteristic nurtures more negative characteristics. Such a circle requires major reforms, push policies and efforts on part of the government to break. Once the circle is broken, the cycle of development begins. We must note here that countries move from lower level of development to higher level of development. They do not stay at the same level always. Governments, society and international organizations come together to help countries grow and develop. Hence, in present times, we do not use the term underdeveloped for any nation. All countries are developing in a way. Their pace and extent of development differs though. Friends, in the earlier lectures, we studied that growth can be measured by quantitative parameters. We also studied the indicators of development. Let us now look at some measures of inequality and measures of human development. One measure of income inequality widely used is the Lorenz curve and Gini coefficient. Lorenz curve was given by American economist Max O. Lorenz in 1905 for measuring inequality of wealth. The Gini coefficient, sometimes termed as the Gini ratio also, was given by Italian statistician Corrado Gini in 1912. Look at the table here. It shows perfect distribution of share in cumulative wealth in one section of the population, whereas for another section of the population it shows unequal share in cumulative percentage of wealth. These are percentages of wealth received by different segments of the population. Let us look at the figures. A perfect distribution of national wealth or national income among all percentiles of households is an ideal situation, but it is not a real distribution for any country in the world. In reality, there always is some unequal distribution. The distribution may be less unequal for the developed countries and it is highly unequal for the developing countries. Lorenz curve and Gini coefficient ratios give this measure of inequality. We see in the figure The first figure shows line of perfect equality. The second figure shows that bottom 20% of the population gets an insignificant share in the income, while the upper percentiles of the population receive a much higher share. As the line of inequality drifts farther from the line of equality, it represents greater inequality. The Gini ratio is expressed in figure and is given as area A upon area A plus area B. As the line of inequality bows out more, there is greater inequality. In other words, as area A becomes larger, inequality increases. Let us now see the measures of human development. The first measure of human development is PQLI, the Physical Quality of Life Index. This was developed in the mid-70s by Morris David Morris. It is an index of well-being of a nation represented by average life expectancy, infant mortality and literacy. How is this measure calculated? Step 1. Find out the worst performance of any country in average life expectancy, infant mortality and literacy. Step 2. Put the worst performance on a scale as 0 and the best performance as 100. Step 3. Find out each of these for any given country and place the actual value of these for this country on the scale of 0 to 100. Step 4. Work out average of the 3 scale values for any given country. Such average index is the PQLI for the country. For example, if for a country average life expectancy is 64 years, then on the scale of 0 to 100 show where 64 stands. Similarly, find out the other parameters for this country and put them on the scale, and the average of this scale is the PQLI for this country. This measure is now replaced by other measures like the Human Development Index. Human Development Index. This index was developed by Mehboob ul Haq and A.K. Sen and introduced by UNDP in 1990, but it was calculated for previous years for various countries. It is an average index of life expectancy at birth, adult literacy rate and combined gross enrollment ratio for primary, secondary and higher education. For each indicator, the index is calculated as actual value minus minimum value upon maximum value minus minimum value. Minimum values for each of these are based on the worst performance found in the world for a particular year. Any country's actual performance is then taken as the actual value. The average index of all the 3 indices is worked out and placed on a scale between 0 and 1. Low human development. HDI lower than 0.5 is low human development. Medium human development. HDI between 0.5 and 0.8 is medium human development. High human development. HDI higher than 0.8 is high human development. Third measure is HPI 1. It is called the Human Poverty Index for developing countries, and HPI 2, which is the Human Poverty Index for the developed countries. The HPI index was developed by UN. It uses indicators of long and healthy life, access to knowledge and a decent standard of living. It is calculated in the same way as HDI. The Multidimensional Poverty Index. It was published for the first time in 2010 in the Human Development Report. The MPI was created by using a technique developed by Sabina Alcaire and James Foster. It is a measure of poverty designed to capture the multiple deprivations that each poor person faces at the same time with respect to education, health and other aspects of living standards. The MPI reflects both the incidence of multidimensional poverty, that is the proportion of people in a population who are multidimensionally poor, and its intensity, that is the average number of deprivations each poor person experiences at the same time. Fifth, the Gender Related Development Index. It was introduced for the first time in Human Development Report of 1995. It is a gender sensitive calculation of HDI. GEM, the Gender Empowerment Index. This was also introduced by UNDP in the Human Development Report in 1995. It is measured using relative economic incomes of women, participation of women in high paying positions with economic power and access to professional and parliamentary positions. Dear friends, let us summarize what we have learnt in this lecture. In this lecture, we understood the characteristics of developing countries. These countries experience a vicious circle of factors which nurture lower development. It requires strong will and effort on part of all national institutions and machinery to break such circles and move towards prosperity. We further saw the various measures of economic inequality and human development.